All right, so today we're actually going to talk about one of my favorite Bible stories in the whole Bible. I really love this story. I think it's relatable. I think it's ridiculous. And I think it's fun. So I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I do. So last week we talked about Deborah. We talked about how, this is no longer the time of Moses. We're no longer wandering in the desert. The Israelites are already living in the promised land, but they're not the only people living in the promised land. Um, and it's, you know, ancient times, right? So when people were very xenophobic, which is a fancy way of kind of saying racist, right? But it means it's not just about skin color. It's about like, you're not like me, right? You're not my people. These different peoples who lived in these different lands often went to war with each other. It's like neighboring villages going to war. Why? Uh, who knows? But that's just kind of the way it was. So the Israelites were not united. They weren't a kingdom. They weren't a nation like we think of a nation. They were basically a big family group that lived in one area, and they were tribes, right? There's the 12 tribes of Israel, and each tribe would have elders, and would kind of, manage themselves, right? But occasionally, you would need somebody who could unite them against an outside threat, and or somebody who, if they were going astray or doing something wrong, God could use as a mouthpiece to talk to them. So we talked about how the word prophet doesn't mean somebody who can see the future. We talked about how prophet means somebody who talks to God and relays God's words to the people. And during this time period, oh, hey, Alexis, welcome to Sunday school. Glad to have you. We are talking about Gideon this morning. So we just started, so you haven't missed anything. Um, so, uh, I forgot where I was. It's okay. It's cool. It's cool. It's cool. Um, a judge is a prophet. But during the time of the judges, during the book of Judges, the judge was basically what they called the prophet, right? And why did they use the word judge? I don't know. They judge Israel, they judge between people, they led Israel. You would have judges. So what we'd often see during this time period is that we have these wars, like I talked about, these little skirmishes. You have these different people groups living in Canaan, right? We talked about how in Joshua, the book of Joshua claims they killed everyone in Canaan. And we talked about how that's an over exaggeration, at least, because there still seem to be people living in Canaan who are not Israelites in the time of the judges. And so you have these people, they don't like each other. They are like, you're not my people group. I don't like you. So they would occasionally conquer each other, go to war with each other, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the setup of this story. This is after the time of Deborah. So we already had that whole thing last week with Sisera and Jael and Deborah. And this is after that. And once again, the Israelites are being oppressed by the Midianites. If that name sounds familiar to you, it's because Midian is where Moses went when he fled Israel. This is a group of people that have been around for a while, but you would think they'd be friends, but just because you were friends 100 years ago doesn't mean you're friends now, right? And there's skirmishes and weird things that happened. So in this case, the Midianites have conquered Israel for about 7 years. And the text says God has allowed it. It says that it's because Israel has done something bad and God was trying to correct the course. We talked about how last week, how that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. That can just be how they viewed it, that they thought they strayed and that's why this happened. But it can be just natural consequences of their actions. It can just be the natural way things were happening in the world, but their interpretation is the only way they could have been oppressed is if God was punishing them. Of course, you can take the text at face value and say God was. The reason I don't tend to lean towards that is because I don't think of God as a cosmic Santa Claus. We don't get punished for doing bad and rewarded for doing good. It doesn't really work that way. But often what happens is we interpret things like that. So we have another case where a people group has come and oppress them. Alexa says, "Hey, you aren't like us, so we're gonna yeet you out of here." Yeah, that's pretty much it. The Midianites are like, "We don't like you. You're not part of us, so we're going to destroy you." Except we're not going to destroy you. We're going to oppress you because it's easier to keep you as like slaves, not really slaves, but like as a people that we can extort, right? So the Midianites don't worship God. It's also heavily applied in this section that because of the Midianite influence, the Israelites basically started worshiping other gods, which is literally like rule 1 of the 10 Commandments, you guys. Don't worship other gods. So the Midianites are now in charge because God wants to remind Israel who their true God is. And the Midianites have basically bankrupted Israel, stealing all their stuff and taking it for their own gain. And the Israelites aren't happy about this, obviously. So they're crying out to God, like, "Please help us." And God's like, "Okay, cool, I got you. Remember Egypt? Like, I had you there too. But I'm going to need you guys to stop worshiping other gods because it's one again. Rule number 1. So God does, in this time, save them. And he chooses a prophet to lead them to freedom. He happens to choose a guy named Gideon. So this is the story we're talking about, is Gideon's call to being a prophet, and how Gideon frees them from the Midianites. So, Judges 6:11 through 18. I'm going to drink some tea real quick. Sorry. Judges 6:11 through 18. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out the wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty warrior." Gideon answered to him, "But sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our ancestors recounted to us, saying, 'Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has cast us off and given us into the hand of Midian.'" Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. I hereby commission you." He responded, "But sir, how can I deliver Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike down the Midianites, every one of them." Then he said to him, "If now I have found favor with you, then show me a sign that it is you who speak to me. Do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you." And he said, "I will stay until you return." Okay, so when we're introduced to Gideon, he's beating wheat in a wine press. When I was in elementary school back in the day, we did a kids play about Gideon twice. We did it twice because we moved a lot, right? So it wasn't like the same church doing it twice. And there's a whole song. It's like, "Beating the wheat in a wine press ain't no fun." It was ridiculous. It's a ridiculous play. It's one of those little kid plays. Why is this important? Why are we emphasizing that he's beating a wheat in a wine press? What does it mean? Basically, he's doing a job that would normally be done in the fields in a safer area where the Midianites won't see him. You don't normally beat the wheat in a wine press, right? A wine press is where you press grapes into wine, not beat wheat, right? Alexa says, Gideon gives off angsty vibes of, "Oh, God is with me?" Pfft, yeah, likely story. 100%. Gideon is like super emo. We're going to see it. Just imagine him, with his hair coming down to like here, covering his eyes, maybe some black eyeliner and being like, "Oh, God." Right? Very emo. So normally this is a job that would be done in the open fields, and instead he's doing it indoors in an area where it wouldn't be done. Why? Remember, the Midianites are everywhere. And in a lot of ways, they're like locusts. If they see something they want, like wheat, which is food, right? They take it. So they have to do tasks like this in secret. Sometimes people use this to say that Gideon is a coward. Maybe. But it's also just like smart. If doing something out in the fields is going to cause someone to come steal what you're doing from you, like you still have to feed your family and your people. So yeah, it makes sense to do it in hiding. It doesn't have to be a cowardice thing, right? That said, as we're going to see, Gideon has his anxieties. So Gideon is just minding his own business, basically doing his job when this angel appears to him. But he doesn't realize it's an angel at first. You know, awesome. And he's just like, "Hey, sir." And the angel is like, "God is awesome and has our backs." And Gideon is like, "If God has our backs, why is life so awful?" Hmm? Hmm? uh, Alexis says that the Midianites are like the seagulls from Finding Nemo. Yes, 100%. Um, so the angel responds to Gideon, and he's like, "Well, God has chosen you to be the next leader of Israel. Surprise!" And remember, Gideon thinks this is just a random dude. So he's like, "Whatever, man. I'm a nobody. Stop messing with me." But the angel's persistent. He's like, "God has our backs." And at this point, Gideon is getting a little suspicious about who he's talking to. So he's like, "Okay, give me a sign whom I'm speaking to. I need to know. But don't like go and disappear on me while I go get the stuff." And the angel's like, "Okay, whatever, dude. Whatever." All right, so now we're going to look at the next section, Judges 6:19 through 23. Talking a lot makes my throat sore. Judges 6:19 through 23. So Gideon went into the house and prepared a kid. Side note, a goat, not a child, a goat. So Gideon went into the house and prepared a kid, and unleavened cakes from an ephah of flour, and the meat he put in the basket, and the broth he put in a pot, and brought them to him under the oak and presented them. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened cakes, and put them on this rock, and pour out the broth." And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Then Gideon perceived that it was the angel of the Lord, and Gideon said, "Help me, Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, Peace be to you. Do not fear. You shall not die." So Gideon goes back into his house and basically brings out a bunch of food for the angel. The angel gives Gideon some specific instructions on what to do with the food, and then boom, spontaneous combustion, right? The food is consumed, and the angel just vanishes from his sight. Gideon is like, "Holy moly, I was literally talking to an angel of the Lord. I thought this guy was totally pulling my leg, but he's not. He was not pulling my leg." And then God, possibly in the form of another angel or possibly just a voice talking directly to him, is like, "Don't be afraid. We're cool, yo. We're cool." Because remember, an angel visiting you, this could be good news or it could be terrible news, right? Like, you never know. It could be death. So Judges 6:24 through 27. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it "The Lord is Peace." To this day, it still stands at Ophrah, which belongs to the Abiezrites. That night the Lord said to him, "Take your father's bull, the second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father, and cut down the sacred pole that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of the stronghold here, in proper order. Then take the second bull, and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the sacred pole that you shall cut down." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the townspeople to do it by day, he did it by night. So God then gives Gideon instructions. Alexis asks, human angel or biblically accurate angel? Well, there's a couple of kinds of angels in the Bible, right? So there are angels that do present as humans in the Bible. When Abraham invited the men into his camp, those were angels. So there are angels who present as human. But yes, there are angels, the biblically accurate angels, so the other types of angels, which are like covered in eyes and a million wings. So this is probably one of those more human-esque angels, like your Gabriel, as opposed to your cherubim, which are terrifying. Not little, babies like in Renaissance paintings. All right. So God gives Gideon instructions. He's like, hey, your dad built this altar to Baal, which is not cool. Remember the whole first commandment about not having other gods? So I'm going to need you to tear down that altar and build me a new one. All right, so Baal was a Mesopotamian god. I don't know a lot about him outside of Stargate SG-1, which is my favorite show of all time, where Baal is played by a South African guy. But I think he was a weather god. And weather gods would have been very important in the ancient world because whether you get rain or not is very important to whether you're going to have crops. So weather is directly related to whether you have food or not, right? So Midianites, the other Canaanites, they would have worshipped gods like Baal. We're going to see Baal pop up a lot in the Old Testament. He's not going away anytime soon, the idea of him at least. And it was very common for people to believe in him. Alexa says he was like Zeus. I mean, he was kind of like Zeus. Zeus, it's different, right? It's a different pantheon. So you can't just map like Zeus's personality onto Baal and say that they would be the same. Yeah, so he's going to come up a lot. You're going to see him over and over and over again. And remember, we talked about one of the reasons why the Israelites were so susceptible to other religions, other gods, is we talked about how they were not like us, right? We today are monotheists, right? We believe there is only one God. We believe the rest of them are basically not real, right? That would be the modern kind of Christian perspective. The ancient Israelites were monolatrists. We talked about how this means that they believed all of the gods were real. They all existed. But their God, the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was the only God who was worthy of worship. So the others existed, but you weren't supposed to worship them. So this is why, today we're like, well, why would I just start worshiping Baal, right? That doesn't make any sense. But that's not kind of how they worked back then. They thought they were all real. They just thought that our God was the greatest God, right? And that's why you kind of see these imageries in the Psalms and stuff as if our God sits on a council of gods and he's the greatest God, because that's kind of how they imagined in their head sometimes, is that these other gods were real, but in the end they all had to answer to our God, and our God was the greatest God. But because they believed the other ones were real, this did make them susceptible to occasionally worshiping them, right? As we see here. So Gideon's own father has an altar to Baal, right? So, yeah. And God's like, I'm going to need you to tear that down. Alexa says, oh, you have a plant god? That's cute. Mine could zap you out of existence if you felt like it. Yeah. I mean, that's what they would believe when they were feeling really good about themselves. But in cases like this, where they're feeling bad about themselves, or not that they're feeling bad about themselves, sometimes they felt like, I shouldn't put all my eggs in one basket, right? So I'm going to worship my God, but the weather's been bad, so maybe I'll also do an altar to Baal, just in case, right? Just cover my bases. And you see people kind of do that today a little bit, but it's not as overt, right? So, God's like, hey, your dad has this altar to Baal. That's not cool. So I'm going to need you to tear it down. So Gideon gets a direct order from God. A direct order. That seems like a no-brainer. You've got to obey that, right? God directly told you to do something. And he does, but not right away, right? Gideon is terrified of what everyone is going to do to him if they see him doing this thing. Because the altar to the Baal would be sacred to his family and the neighbors, even though they're all Israelites who are supposed to be worshiping God. So Gideon does it, but he does it under the cover of night. Now, once again, this is how Gideon kind of gets this characterization of being a coward. And I do think, as we're going to talk about, I do think Gideon suffered from anxiety. But I also think it's just smart to do it under the cover of night, unless you have like an army backing you. Now, granted, Gideon should have been more confident in God, that God was backing him. He didn't need an army. He had God. But, Gideon does it under the cover of night. He's a little more anxious. So yeah, I don't think the people are going to feel too good about this when they wake up in the morning and see their altar is gone. So Judges 6:28 through 32. Judges 6:28 through 32. When the townspeople rose early in the morning, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the sacred pole beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. So they said to one another, "Who has done this?" After searching and inquiring, they were told, "Gideon, son of Joash, did this." Then the townspeople said to Joash, "Bring your son so that he might die, for he has pulled down the altar of Baal and cut down the sacred pole beside it." But Joash said to all who were arrayed against him, "Will you contend for Baal, or will you defend his cause? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been pulled down." Therefore on that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he pulled down his altar. All right, so the people are furious because they wake up and they see their sacred altar is gone. They immediately want to know who do it, and somehow they find out. Just because he did it at night doesn't mean somebody wouldn't see it. So maybe a servant told him, maybe somebody saw, we don't know. But I seriously doubt it was Gideon who told them. The townspeople go to Gideon's dad, who remember owned this altar, and are like, "Give us your son, because we're going to kill him for what he did." Now, Gideon's dad doesn't want his son to die, so he offers an alternative plan. He's like, "Well, shouldn't it be Baal who cares that Gideon took down his altar? If that's the case, we should let Baal take care of Gideon. After all, if Baal is a god, then he's powerful enough to do whatever." And the people are basically like, "I guess that makes sense. Fine, we'll let Baal do with it." Baal, Baal, it depends on who's reading it, right? So, I mean, this is cool that Gideon's dad defends him, right? Especially since it was like Gideon's dad's altar. But, he doesn't want his son to die. All right, Judges 6:33 through 35. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and crossing the Jordan, they camped in the valley of Jezreel. And the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. He sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. So the Midianites are amassing, maybe to take the Israelites out again, maybe to do something else. And Gideon feels the Spirit of the God come upon him. And basically he sounds a trumpet and sends out messengers to get a whole army together, which seems like a pretty brave move for a guy who took down an altar in the middle of the night. Has Gideon learned bravery? We shall see. Judges 6:36 through 38. Then Gideon said to God, "In order to see whether you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have said, I am going to lay a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on the ground, then I shall know that you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he arose early next morning, he squeezed the fleece. He wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. So Gideon has not, in fact, learned bravery. Gideon is literally pulling together an army to take down the Midianites. And he's like, "I don't know, God. Are you sure you mean me? Are you sure you want me to do this? I'm not sure. So I'm going to do a little test." And he puts a fleece of wool out. So, a fleece, just like some wool. And is like, "If when I wake up, it's wet with dew, but the ground around it is dry, then I know. Then I know you mean me." And of course, God means him. God's like, "This is easy." So the fleece is wet the next morning and the ground is dry. So Gideon should be good, right? He should be like, "All right, God, let's go defeat some Midianites." Yeah, no, that doesn't happen. Judges 39 through 40, or 6:39 through 40. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not let your anger burn against me. Let me speak one more time. Let me please make trial with the fleece just once more. Let it be dry only on the fleece, and on all the ground let there be dew." And God did so that night. It was dry to the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. Gideon. He's like, I guess the whole fleece being wet thing could have been a coincidence, right? So why don't we try this again? Please do the opposite this time. The fleece is going to be dry and the ground is going to be wet. I feel like in heaven, God's like rolling his eyes and is like, okay, Gideon, let's do this. So the fleece is dry and the ground is wet. At this point, Gideon seems to get the message that God has indeed, unfortunately, chosen him. We see a lot, right? That God chooses the person who like least wants to be chosen. So Judges 7, 1 through 3. Judges 7, 1 through 3. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the troops that were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And in the camp of Midian was north of them, below the hill of Morah in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, the troops with you are too many for me to give with Midianites into their hand. Israel would only take credit away from me, saying, my hand has delivered me. Now, therefore, proclaim this in the hearing of the troops. Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home. Thus Gideon sifted them out. 22,000 returned, and 10,000 remained. So Gideon gathers all of these troops. He basically has 32,000 men, which is a lot. And when you're going to take on an enemy army, the more people you have, the better, right? But God is like, Gideon, this army is too mighty. It's too big. If you have that many people in the army, you guys are going to think that it's because of you, because of your power that you won this, and not because of my power. I want you to know that it's God who delivered you. And so why don't you tell everyone who's scared that they can go home? I'm sure at this point, Gideon asked, does that include me, God? Can I go home? And God was like, no. But the Bible doesn't say that. But I could totally see that happening, right? Anyway, 22,000 men leave, leaving 10,000 behind. I'm sure at this point, Gideon is a little more nervous because he was nervous to start with. And is like, but 10,000 isn't too bad for an army, right? 10,000's cool. Well, let's see. Judges 7, 4 through 8. Then the Lord said to Gideon, the troops are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them out for you there. When I say this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. And when I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So he brought the troops down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, all those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps, you shall put to one side. All those who kneel down to drink, putting their hands to their mouths, you shall put to the other side. The number of those that lapped was 300, but all the rest who knelt down to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 that lapped I will deliver you, and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go home. So he took the jars of the troops from their hands and their trumpets and sent all the rest of Israel back to their own tents, but he retained the 300. The camp of Midian was below him in the valley. So 10,000 men. It's a reasonable army. And God is like, nope, still too many. Still too many. Let's winnow it down again. Which I'm sure promptly caused Gideon to cry. I would. So God tells them to go to the water, and everyone who drinks like a dog by putting their head in the water should be put to one side, and the others who drink like civilized people should go on the other side. And then, does God choose the civilized people? No, he does not. He chooses the ones who lapped like dogs. And then says, send everyone else home. 300 men. Gideon is left with 300 men. If I was Gideon, we would be queuing a freak out at this moment. And if that wasn't enough, does God have Gideon hand out swords to everyone? No. Instead, he gives them trumpets and jars, which, occasionally you'll see be referred to as pitchers. But basically, you can imagine them as clay jars, water-carrying clay jars. What the heck are we supposed to be doing with trumpets and jars against the army of Midian? Alexa says he probably started internally panicking. Internally, externally, crying to God, being like, why God? Why did you choose me? I'm sure much panic was happening. All right, next section. Judges 7, 9 through 14. That same night the Lord said to him, get up, attack the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you fear to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to attack the camp. Then he went down with his servant Purah to the outposts of the armed men that were in the camp. The Midianites and the and those guys. And all the people of the east lay along the valley as thick as locusts, and their camels were without number, countless as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon arrived, there was a man telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, I had a dream. And in it, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell. It turned upside down, and the tent collapsed. And his comrade answered, There is no other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has given Midian and all the army. All right, it's time to attack the camp. And God is like, hey, Gideon, it's time. But if you're scared, which you and I know Gideon is, you should go down to the enemy camp with your servant, because I know you won't want to go alone because you're scared. And then afterward, you'll feel better. I'm sure Gideon was like, yeah, right, God. Feel better. But he does it anyway. Gideon's probably like, I've got 300 men. This is an army that is described as thick as locusts, and their camels are without number. We're gonna die. But he goes. So he goes down with his servant to this enemy camp, and then he hears two men talking about a dream. And one of them literally says, oh, your dream means that God is going to deliver Midian to Gideon. So maybe that was a confidence booster. You know, little shot of go get him. Be like, yes, I got this. You know, my 300 men are going to take on these guys who are as countless as the sand on the seashore. I don't know. If I was Gideon, I still wouldn't be convinced. All right. So Judges 7:16 through 22. Judges 7:16 through 22. All right. Alexa's saying, the guy is saying, yeah, we're screwed. Yeah. No, you would think they wouldn't think that, but we'll see. After he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets into the hands of all of them, and empty jars with torches and empty jars with torches inside the jars, he said to them, look at me and do the same. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets around the whole camp and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 who were with him came down to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. When they had just set the watch, they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. So the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars, holding in their left hands the torches and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Every man stood in his place all around the camp, and all the men in the camp ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Mehelah by Tabbath. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say any of these places. So Gideon goes back to the camp and divides his people up. And he gives them a battle plan, which boils down to this. They're going to make a lot of noise. They're going to blow trumpets. They're going to smash clay pitchers. They're going to shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. And 300 dudes are like, cool. And they do it. It's crazy. And it works. A sword for the Lord and Gideon, they shout, while blowing trumpets and smashing pots. And the Midianites, they just run in terror. They're scared out of their mind. They're gone. It's crazy. It's a crazy plan. It's crazy that it works, which is what God wanted, right? He didn't want them to say it worked because I'm awesome. They wanted it to say it worked because God's awesome. So Gideon then sends out some messengers, and they make sure they capture the leaders of the fleeing army, which they do, and they kill them, and they win. So this is probably an even crazier battle plan than Jericho, and it works. 300 men, no weapons between them, and they win. No one doubts that it's God's might, and not Israel's, that brought the Midianites down that day. This ridiculous winning strategy, which is it's ridiculous, is one of the reasons why I love this story. Because it's not only it's not the only or most important story like this in the Bible, but there is something unique to the story of Gideon that a lot of other stories don't have, and that I think a lot of other people overlook. So there are multiple verses in the Bible that say we shouldn't test God. So you have Deuteronomy 6:16 that says, "Do not put the Lord your God to test." We have Isaiah 7:12, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to test." We have Luke 4:12. Jesus answered him, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to test." And yet, Gideon tests God 3 times. 3 times. Once when he tests the angel, asking him to prove who he is. Twice when he puts out the fleece for God, asking for a different sign. Each time, God just patiently does what Gideon asks to prove that Gideon is the one God wants and is talking to. The night of the battle, when Gideon is undoubtedly uncertain if they're going to be able to win, with 300 men and no weapons, God doesn't rebuke Gideon and say, "Hey, why are you so unfaithful? Just believe and do what I say." No. Instead, God tells him to go down to the other camp and gives him yet another sign that Gideon will prevail. He even lets him take his servant with him, which just 2 chapters earlier and last week, when we were talking about Deborah, right, we saw that Deborah rebuked Barak for being scared to go alone. And here, God is telling Gideon, it's okay. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to take your servant. Why is this different? Why is this story so different? How can it be 2 chapters away, and in 1 chapter, when a man asked for his hand to be held in a battle, God was basically like, "Psh, because of that, you get nothing." And in this one, God's like, "I'm going to hold your hand the whole way, Gideon." Gideon is constantly described as being afraid. He's hiding in a wine press when the angel finds him. He's too afraid to take down the altar during the day, so he goes during the night. He's too afraid to go to the enemy camp at night. He also thinks he's nothing special. He tells the angel that it can't be Gideon the angel means will save Israel, because Gideon is a nobody, a nothing. Is Gideon a coward? We've already talked about that some have described him as such, but a coward makes it seem selfish, as if Gideon is only concerned for his own safety. But I don't think God would be so patient with such a selfish desire. So why is God so patient with Gideon when we've seen him be impatient with others? It's kind of a rhetorical question. I'm letting it pause. Okay. So when I read this story, what I see is anxiety. Gideon is afraid. He is anxious. It's not just a selfish fear for his own life. He literally believes he can't be the man God means, and that if God puts faith in Gideon, that Gideon will fail God. And to me, Gideon just screams as a textbook case of anxiety. And I don't mean just like worried, right? I mean anxiety like the mental health issue, right? Like the kind of anxiety that is just like you constantly feel like there's bad guy music playing in the background of your life, even though things are fine. You're just, getting ready for bed, and suddenly it's like bad guy music, and you're like, why? Anxiety is not just being worried. We all worry. Anxiety is this level of worry and uncertainty that most of us can't understand. An anxious person often needs constant reassurance. It needs to be told multiple times not to worry about a thing. And in modern times, we have, therapy and medication and things that can take care of this. But they didn't have that in Gideon's time. This isn't faithlessness. This is mental illness. And I think that is why God is so patient with Gideon. It's not that Gideon doesn't believe. It's that Gideon is so anxious that he can't be sure that the signs really mean what they mean, or if his mind is playing tricks on him, or if he's remembering wrong. It's like the OCD person who checks the locks on the door 3 times, right? They know they locked the door, or they don't. Maybe they don't recall if they locked the door. They're anxious. Did they lock the door? They have to check again and then again, because surely that first check didn't matter. It doesn't. They don't remember. It doesn't tell them anything. So if this was just plain old-fashioned testing, I think God would get angry with Gideon. But I don't think it is plain old-fashioned testing. I think it's Gideon going back to the door to check that it's locked again. It's not a test, right? It's a reassurance, and it's something he feels like he has to do. But because instead we see that God doesn't rebuke Gideon. He holds Gideon's hand through this whole process and constantly reassures him, never rebuking him. And he leads Gideon to victory, to a victory that Gideon could never have even imagined. God met Gideon where he was at. God saw this anxious man and said, this is the one I want to lead my people. And because God knew about Gideon's anxiety, he was patient and compassionate. God always meets us where we're at, and he can use us no matter what may be wrong with us. And God knows that mental illness is not faithlessness. It's just like any other illness. It's just like a broken bone. It's just like having the flu, right? It's not faithlessness. It's sickness. And God has always been willing to work with sick people, right? He's always been willing to work with broken people because we're all broken people. And I think that's why the story of Gideon is so important, right? Gideon is like a lot of us, right? And God still saw him as worthy, right? It's like Avengers Endgame, right? Depressed Thor. His depression does not stop him from being worthy of Mjolnir, right? And that is Gideon. So that is today's lesson. That is the end of it. I hope you enjoyed it. Gideon is one of my favorite stories. And now we will do prayer requests.